next conversation will be all around nostalgia and how across the world, leaders, particularly authoritarian leaders, are using nostalgia as a tool to rewrite history, to control, and to serve their own interests. And for this next panel, we are in great, great hands. 4 amazing people who will be really interrogating this and seeing how we can resist the narratives that are being placed on us. We have Garry, Pierre-Pierre, an award-winning journalist, Jillian Green, editor-in-chief of the Daily Maverick, Zeg, co-founder, and Coda Story co-founder, Natalia Antelava, and they'll be moderated by a Zeg legend, Julie Posetti from the International Center of Journalists.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this discussion. Yes, it will be a tone shift. We're going to take a global lens to this pernicious trend, this idea of weaponizing nostalgia. And I just want to set the scene a bit based on some research that I've led with colleagues at the International Center for Journalists. So we found that from the US to Brazil to South Africa, the Philippines, and here in Georgia, weaponized nostalgia is fueling new forms of authoritarianism by infecting democratic deliberation and the outcome of elections. And that's happening around the world. We've looked closely at these 5 countries. And we've done that through our Disarming Disinformation project, which has tracked this trend from Tbilisi to New York, via Manila, Sao Paulo, and Johannesburg. And as I said, we've done that through a study of news organizations' encounters with disinformation narratives and their responses to those narratives featured in information pollution more broadly within those countries. We've also studied audience reactions to disinformation in these countries. So just to put some narrative wrapping around this idea, we see this here in Georgia with the Kremlin's allies having assumed political control with the aid of Soviet-era nostalgia. In the US, we see the Make America Great Again campaign slogan and movement, the MAGA movement, delivering President Trump a second term in the White House despite his 34 felony convictions and an insurrection. In the Philippines, thanks in part to a revisionist history campaign, the Marcos family has been returned to the presidential palace 30 years after the dictator Ferdinand Marcos was overthrown in the People Power Revolution. Meanwhile, in Brazil, the Bolsonarist forces are resurgent and they're riding a wave that arcs towards the past and invokes dictatorship days. So it's back to the future all over again. And that's the cue for our video.
Мира и счастья всем!
Dangerous words. It can't happen here, and I'd add to that, it can't happen again. And Natalia, let's start with you. What does step 2 in the authoritarian playbook, which you've identified as the weaponization of nostalgia, look like in Georgia?
Yeah, so the video that you just saw, thanks Julie. The video that you just saw is part of the series that we're currently running at Coda Story called The Playbook, which is all about the authoritarian playbook, which really builds on years of reporting on the toolbox that people with authoritarian agendas use to get hold of power and keep it. And nostalgia is a huge part of it, as you say, the world over. And the way that it exhibits itself here is actually particularly interesting because, but I kind of have to talk about it in context of Russia and the Kremlin's interests in Georgia. Obviously, for the man whose kind of goal in life has been to restore the great empire, the great Russian Empire, Soviet Empire. That's Vladimir Putin, in case you're confused, who called the dissolution of the Soviet Union the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. So he, the tactics that Russians have used in Russia and in Georgia are different, and yet they kind of push similar. They have the same end goal, but there are different narratives that are being pushed. In Russia, long before the Ukraine invasion, long before the occupation and annexation of Crimea, we saw again and again all across Russian state television, but really across all cultural spaces, the pushing for that sentiment that Soviet Union was such a wonderful thing, and what a shame that we don't have that anymore. And it exhibited itself in so many ways through TV series that glorified the Soviet era, through talk shows, exhibitions, you name it.
Even food, right?
Everything, like literally everything. And but in Georgia, Russians have kind of a very tricky, and this is where they're incredibly effective at finding those weak points and like really pushing them. In Georgia, the Russians Kremlin has traditionally faced a pretty, challenging task because this country is very much shaped by centuries of like anti-Russian sentiment. This country is 20% of it is occupied by Russia. So like, how do you change the narrative in a country that's against you? The biggest weapon here that has been used is Georgia's most infamous son, Joseph Stalin. We're not proud of him, or at least I'm not, but there's certainly the message that has consistently come and seeped through and has found a fertile ground here was, look at us, this tiny country who gave the world one of its greatest dictators. Let's be proud of it. So when you combine that with the fact that there has been very little kind of examining and re-examining of the Soviet crimes. And there have been attempts, and we have, great walking tours. I hope, if you're visiting for the first time, go on. There's a walking tour that's organized by Sovlab, an amazing organization that works on kind of trying to restore historic facts that have been buried and hidden. Yeah, and totally lost my train of thought.
That's fine, because, but I love this. I love
anyway.
this idea of immersing yourself in facts through a history tour, which takes you down the route of nostalgia, but with the idea of trying to reclaim the facts in the context of nostalgia.
That's right. If they use it, we should use it too.
So I'm going to move to Garry now, and I should say, actually, to provide some more context. So Natalia and her Coda Story team are partners on our Disarming Disinformation project, as is Garry's The Haitian Times, which he's very recently stepped back from as executive editor and CEO. And The Haitian Times was caught up in the maelstrom that was triggered by Donald Trump and J.D. Vance during the election campaign, with the odious slogan, "They're eating our cats and dogs." So reporting for and on behalf of and with the Haitian diaspora community in the US has given Garry a frontline experience and his team a frontline experience of what both the weaponization of nostalgia and targeted disinformation look like in combination. And Jillian's The Daily Maverick in South Africa is also a partner news organization. So this is research-informed conversation here, I just wanted to point out. But Garry, can I come to you next? Because we sat on a stage in Perugia in Italy only 2 months ago, having a conversation very similar to this about the same theme. And you said at the time, when we discussed the fact that that we are seeing these authoritarian and autocratic political acts in the US built on this, yearning for simpler times and safer, more optimistic times, and the way this was instilling fear in you, and you, as a black migrant living in the US, who is, of course, now a US citizen, and your colleagues and your communities. You said then you were feeling fearful. I want to ask you, in the past 2 months, how has that shifted, and how has this yearning for simpler, safer times actually unfolded?
Yeah, I rewatched the session that we had, Julie, and I'm even more fearful right now because it's happening in real time. You all have heard, I've seen what's happening in Los Angeles, and Donald Trump is instigating a lot of this because he really wants to roll out the Marines in our cities in America. I think you mentioned Back to the Future. For me, it's been more triggering because my parents left a similar situation when I was a child to come to the United States to find freedom and democracy. And one of the reasons why the Haitian Times fought back so fiercely was that we didn't want to go back. I know how this ends, as most of you here know what happens in authoritarian states. And so the issue is, I think, the reason why we're back here is because democracy is just hard. I mean, I watched Haiti began its democratic experiment in 1986. At the same time, Ferdinand Marcos was deposed. There was a trend back then of getting rid of the dictators. Now they're all back. They're all back. Same names in case of the Philippines and Haiti. It's the same ideology, the right-wing ideology that gave us about 40 years of dictatorship of the Duvalier regime. And that's not good. And I'm an American by choice. In fact, I became an American when I was in college. And the reason for it was that I wanted to serve America. I wanted to join a Peace Corps. That was such a dream of mine. And when I found out that you had to be an American citizen to become a Peace Corps volunteer, and I said, no problem, because then I felt that American values were my values. And it's really difficult. It's been really hard for me the last 10 years, because this started in 2015. And then watching it getting worse and worse, and folks in America not doing anything about it for the most part. And this is what happened in Haiti, and look where Haiti is today. Although I doubted that America will get to Haiti because of the underlying problems that Haiti had over the 200 years of its independence, but it can happen here, meaning in the United States.
Yeah. And can we just talk about the impacts of the weaponization of this white framing of nostalgia, white, right, masculine framing of nostalgia in the US, which has been a trigger for the rollback of rights almost overnight in the most extraordinary ways. So the implications when white supremacist rhetoric is effectively mainstreamed in association with memories of times past that were somehow safer and greater, what does that do? I mean, we're seeing riots on the street now, but what does it do at an individual level for somebody like you who has built a life in the US, who's a Pulitzer Prize-winning, journalist formerly of the New York Times, who left the New York Times to serve the community that had fled a dictatorship in Haiti?
Well, it's dehumanizing, and this is again why we fought back, because to some context, the whole idea of Haitians eating pets, it's a trope as old as Haiti itself. And they know that. And it was an easy target because they went after our editor, special projects editor, because she was pushing back hard. And I was really proud of her work out in Springfield, Ohio. But they came after her so hard because she's a black woman, immigrant. She speaks English now, but as far as they're concerned, non-English speaking. And so this was unacceptable because she should have been a maid, a nanny. And who are you to be reporting, challenging us about facts? Yeah. And so this is what's happening. I think this whole war against DEI is all about that. But there's a term in America, it's fuck around and find out. Right now, we're about to find out what's going to happen.
When you fuck around. Yeah, exactly. And misogyny is often, according to our research, bound up with the weaponization of nostalgia, so misogynistic tropes. And in the case of McElvey, who you referenced there, who was your special projects editor, and this is a topic for another conversation, but I just want to call out what lived experience looks like in terms of physical risk in the US, and this was prior to the election. She was swatted, which means that someone made a false police report that there had been a homicide in the home of a black woman journalist in New York, where the risk of police at your door is physical, and she suffered intensely after that.
Well, yeah, I mean, she recollect that story so often. It's every time I think about it, it's scary because the NYPD, New York Police Department, sent about 7 police officers. They surrounded the house. It was about 9 o'clock in the morning, and she was trying to figure out what's going on. She thought when the doorbell was ringing, she thought it was an Amazon delivery, and she said, well, they can just leave the package. But the knock kept insisted, and so she found out that cops were all around her house. And I don't think, and I've spoken with her about this, I don't think she's okay. Because I've seen her personality change. She laughed a lot, and it's a nervous laughter. And it's gonna take us some time to recover from that experience. But meanwhile, we're powering through it because this is what we do. We're journalists. We think about what we do, and we don't think a lot about ourselves. At least that was my generation. And I've been telling the staff, although I'm not involved in the day-to-day operations, but being 6 months removed, they still drag me into stuff. And I said, well, you guys have to take care of yourself because this is not, this is a long game. It's not gonna end tomorrow, and we have to be prepared and do everything that we need to do to lead this fight. I mean, and if that's what we have to do, it is what it is.
Because they roll back rights as they rewrite history. Yes. And we have to be really alert to that, and it's a long haul. And how long will it take to even recover once, this ends, if it indeed does end? If Maria Ressa were here and she had hoped to join us, she would have related hard to your story, Garry, about fleeing a dictatorship for the safety and security of the US, where if you were here last year, you heard her talking about migrating to the US as a 10-year-old. And starting, a news organization back in Manila years later, and watching, even as she spends more time in the US as a professor at Columbia, how it's history repeating itself for her. And I think, Jillian, you will relate particularly to Garry's point about the way that migration tropes, are used in concert with nostalgia for a kind of whiter, greater time. In South Africa, which again ties back to the US, we have seen the disinformation narratives around white genocide applying to farmers who are Afrikaans-speaking farmers. This idea that necessitates them seeking refugee status in the America that we're talking about unraveling, here. So can you speak to what that's been like to watch as an editor in South Africa?
Yeah, it's almost unbelievable to see the claims being made by a group of people who essentially are more privileged, have more access to power, to resources than others, claim a status of refugee. And it's completely disbelievable, actually, when you think about it. But the truth of the matter is that fertile ground exists for this kind of weaponization of nostalgia. When you have rampant corruption, when you have perceptions of declining safety, when you have an economic situation that people don't feel they can thrive in, this kind of narrative can take hold. But it's not just in that particular grouping. Black South Africans also are almost hankering for a promise, and again, it's about corruption. It's about a failing public service, that it's not hankering for apartheid, but hankering after the promise of liberation and what that held for them. So the narrative that is being promoted and given air by international players like the US and the president of the US. Thanks, I accept your apology. And our own former countryman, Elon Musk.
Yes.
Who you've got to understand the motivation behind pushing this particular narrative. It is not about supposed struggling farmer.
Yeah, and this is a man whose grandfather had tried to seed a kind of, a technocracy, an authoritarian movement in Canada, and now he's exported that to the US via South Africa with this disinformation campaign that dates back 10, 15 years around the farming community. But I just want to unpick something that you said too about, this nostalgic vibe in concert with disinformation affecting the black communities as well. So we see the revival of President Zuma, who was actually jailed for corruption, and despite being barred from running in the election, a new political party has formed around him. And we see the sort of, it's the mythology to an extent around, the power and armed kind of responders to the apartheid movement in a sort of militarized anti-apartheid movement. So can you talk a bit about that as well? Like, you've got these two things happening in concert where there's a real attempt to pound those fracture lines in South Africa, which are very much along race lines, of course, historically.
Yeah, and very much, dividing a country.
Yeah.
And weaponizing memory. And that also falls at the door of the ANC. They make reference to the 9 wasted years. And those are specifically reference to Zuma and work that Zuma did within that particular period. But in the ANC, referring to it as 9 wasted years, it wasn't us, it was him only. And so that's where the danger starts to come into play. Just to go back to Zuma being jailed for corruption, we actually haven't even got that far yet.
Yeah.
He was jailed because he didn't, appear when he should have.
Right, contempt in connection with the corruption trial. Yes, yeah.
So just to make sure that we get the facts.
Yes, thank
on
you.
The table.
Very important.
It's important to realize that even in his revival through the MK party, is that don't worry about what's happened. Think about who I can be again, and it's bringing back, the Bolsonaro kind of effect, the Marco family kind of effect, the Zuma. While he may not be able to stand for presidency, his daughter is a leader within the party, and so she's got aspirations.
Yes, which exactly parallels the situation in the Philippines, where it's the daughter of Duterte, the recent dictator, who is now challenging power. And just to say, the elephant in the room in all of this, it's not really an elephant, it's the broligarchy. It's the big tech actors, who are acting with the authoritarian leaders now to facilitate a sort of viralization of these movements and to help revive these disinformation narratives that are tied up with nostalgia. And just an anecdote from my own cultural context. So I'm Australian by birth. I live in the UK now. But back in the 90s, Australia elected a Conservative Prime Minister called John Howard, who actually was one of the first Western democratic leaders to offshore migration detention centres that deport refugees to islands that were foreign territory and then excised Australian islands, right? So this is the backdrop to say that he was elected on a nostalgia platform, and the platform slogan was, make Australia relaxed and comfortable again. Right? And this is 1996. So it's almost like, this began for me in my observation then. So can we bring this question back now to how to respond? And Natalia, CODA looks at this challenge. I mean, you've been very prescient as a news organisation to observe this and to start tracking it. And you try to tell these stories at a global level, but you're Georgian, and members of your team are also Georgian, and CODA was Georgia-born. So can you kind of infuse your approach to these stories from your Georgian perspective, growing up in a Soviet and post-Soviet era situation here, and now trying to translate these stories for a world that wants to deny history, that wants to rewrite history?
You know, in some way, yes. I mean, we basically try to connect the dots, and we try to find these underlying patterns that we follow, and weaponizing nostalgia, rewriting history, manipulation of memory. You know, the memory politics in general. It's all very much part of. What is really the old power game, right? It's a game for money and power. And it has been, these things have been weaponized very effectively, as has technology. You mentioned the oligarchy, you know, the fact that most of our information comes to us through companies that are run by a handful of billionaires who have, we now know, we've seen the Oval Office with the Silicon Valley represented at the Trump inauguration. It's run by a handful of billionaires. Like, this is, you know, a new version of like state propaganda, right? Except we're not being kind of fed one unified narrative. It's being tailored much more effectively to us. So whether it's the nostalgia for safer times for white South Africans, or you know, or white men in America, and or you know, people here who kind of want the solace of being like proud of something when like the world is falling apart. You know, like it almost doesn't matter. Like fear is the same kind of like the kind of the anti-migrant sentiments, or what Trump did with the you know, the Ohio, the Haitian story. They're all sort of the same emotional pressure points that can be pressed very effectively now. Like what I'm personally really interested in when it comes to like I feel like we kind of cracked how to cover it. Like we find stories that tell the underlying human story. Like go to codastory.com, you know, like we have done the film on Georgia called What to Do with Stalin, that kind of digs into this like real identity crisis of a country that is like cannot figure out its relationship with its most infamous son, and how that is being manipulated because the history books were not written properly at the time, right? So, and we've done these stories all around the world. What I'm really interested in, and I'm kind of not trying to take over Julie's moderation, but like I'm actually really interested in trying to tell the stories of people who are being manipulated, not the billionaires in power and not the politicians, but people who feel that, people who feel something. You know, I remember I was a reporter living in India, and I remember going to an Indian village. We were doing a story on sex trafficking, on trafficking of women in northern India. And we went to a meeting of the elders. It was a panchayat, you know, it was like 150 elders, all men in this Indian village, and they spent 2 hours discussing what to do with girls who are now riding scooters and motorbikes. And it was so fast. This is like back in 2013, 14, and it was just so fascinating because like one thing that I saw very clearly was confusion and loss. Like they were confused about their diminishing power. So like these are stories that I'm really interested in, and you know, I don't know, like there are various ways of listening and trying
so let's, I mean, Garry, I remember you telling me something when we were doing our research interviews with you about what it was like when you left the New York Times to start the Haitian Times, and how you were reflecting on this question of nostalgia being weaponized, and you talked about how you had physical like protesters outside your then offices in Brooklyn with reverence to the Haitian dictators past. And so how did you tackle that? Like how have you tried to, because I think you've done to an extent what Natalia is talking about, like you've tried to explain to your community and engage with those who come from that revisionist history perspective.
Well, it's a continuum. It hasn't stopped. I mean, right now, given the state of Haiti, people are looking for the glory days. And the glory days, guess what? It was the dictatorship, because the country was clean. There was no violence. People didn't fear for the safety. But it was a false sense of security because we were zombified by then, because you obeyed. There was no protest. Of course it was good. But everyone forget what it really was like. And so what we do at the Haitian Times, and the Haitian Times is very, is somewhat of a unicorn. It's a community and local and ethnic publication that has almost a mainstream bent about it. And sometimes our identity, people are unsure, even within the community, because when we cover some of the Haitian American elected officials in Brooklyn, some of the things that they're doing wrong, then we become the target. But it's okay. I tell people all the time, they tell me, well, it must have been, it's tough for you at running the Haitian Times. And I said, well, actually, it's not. You have to think about spending 8 years at the New York Times. That's hard.
I want to come back to that idea, though, in a moment of how you... Well, actually, let's do it now, Garry. So I know you were doing town halls, right, with communities in the midst of the election campaign last year, at the time of the cats and dogs malicious disinformation narrative surging. And you had to deal with people in those communities buying into those tropes, right? And so how did you try to engage the perpetrators of that disinformation and the weaponization of nostalgia while also serving your Haitian communities?
Well, one of the things that, we're privileged to be journalists, to be able to have a voice and tell a story. And so I think at this moment, we do our job, right? And so this is when it really started falling apart for me in many ways, because we had anchored U.S. elections coverage in Ohio, in Springfield, because for 2 years, the Haitian Times had been tracking the situation in Springfield, Ohio, because Haitian migrants were brought there to help the factories revive because they couldn't find workers or cheap workers. And so there were a lot of attacks. People were following them to stores and assaulted them, taking their money. So we had been writing about that. So we got a small grant from American Press Institute to help us cover the elections. At first, we wanted to go to Florida because that's where we have a large Haitian community. Then McElvey had the bright idea, you know what, let's do it out of Springfield, Ohio. It was even before all this nonsense. And so we were ready. We organized a town hall discussions that we thought similar to this. And because we didn't want to parachute in. We want to really feel and hear the community's voices about the challenges they were facing and what can be done. A couple of days before the forum and a couple of days before the whole thing blew up, the town officials, the city officials, told us that they could not guarantee our safety. And my mind went blank. Am I in Haiti or am I in the United States? And so we went ahead anyway, but we took the conversation online, and anticipating of what would happen, we got 3 volunteers to monitor the social media posts that were coming, and they were vile. And so we were just like whack-a-mole, just taking them out one at a time. And we went about our business, and we haven't relented ever since.
So Jillian, in the context of South Africa, where you've described, it's a very divided society, physically as well as economically, racially, how have you tried to cover these disinformation narratives, to Natalia's point, by trying to understand what motivates these beliefs, and with a view to trying to wake people up out of this nostalgic wet dream about greater times that were actually more violent, more destructive times?
Yeah, I think you've got to look at it from the point of view of how do we interrogate this idea of nostalgia, and be mindful that we have to counter the romanticism that accompanies it. And the only way really to do that is to reflect the complex truths around it. The narrative being pushed is quite a simplistic one. White farmers are being attacked, their land is being taken. That's not a fact. what are the factors, to look at what statistics are available, tell those stories through the stats and empirical data that's available, and tell it through the stories of people who are actually experience this violence in a very real way. In telling the stories, we've got to understand whose voices are being heard. How are we as the media making space for those voices that don't have the platform, that don't have the power to tell their own stories? And I think that's the way we've got to counter it, and that's the way we've been trying to counter it. Also, we've got to meet our audiences where they are. Sometimes I think as media, we tend to speak amongst ourselves in this echo chamber of, look at what the wonderful thing that I'm doing, rather than, is this thing actually relatable to the audience that it needs to reach? And if it's not, what do we need to change to make sure? Otherwise, we don't move the needle, you know. And you know, the town hall example is one of those. Is not everybody's going to have data to access the free news on Daily Maverick. So how are we going to get that story to them?
Yeah.
You know, how do we become less extractive in our journalism?
Yeah.
And more inclusive in terms of getting the story back to those communities we are talking
Indeed.
about.
And you're talking about a society which is heavily multilingual, like 11 national languages,
11.
am I right? Yeah.
12 if you include sign.
Yeah. And just a shout out to one of Jill's colleagues, Marianne Tam, who has blended comedy and theatre and truth-telling to try and upend some of this. We might come back to that if we have a chance. If not, check it out. Taking investigative storytelling into new forms, which I know Coda does a lot of too, through live journalism. And I think we might be seeing some here during this festival. So Natalia, if we want to shift this up a gear, given what you said should be the objective of sort of trying to understand, how do people get captured by these, the mythology connected to nostalgia and the ways in which disinformation agents are manipulating it?
You'd like me to give you a solution?
Just riff off one.
I don't think, I don't want to sound pessimistic, but I don't think, I don't know we can. I don't think there is a simple solution. There just isn't. I think it requires a much more systemic change. And, you can't fix it from one, like journalists are not going to be able to fix it, and filmmakers are not going to be able to fix it. And this narrative shift requires sort of a much a kind of big, it's all tied into inequality and the way that power is distributed, and the way that, where we are headed now is basically, looks to me like some sort of a new, like it's not even authoritarianism as we understood it in the last century. It's some sort of like, it's techno-feudalism of some sort. Yeah. And in that, but I mean, the good thing is like, we also know, we know how our minds can be manipulated. We can, on individual level, make certain choices. Joe Sabia's previous panel, he's throwing his, I was shocked he's not on Instagram anymore, and he's throwing his phone into the lake. I salute him. I sit here with two. I shouldn't be doing that. But it's all, I think on a very individual level, it's the awareness of the manipulation and self-awareness. The story I often tell during the full-scale invasion in Ukraine, I was in the UK, and a week after the invasion, a 14-year-old family member said to me, "Is the war over?" And I said, "No, why do you say that?" And he said, "Because it was all over my TikTok and it's not anymore." And, it was just simply the nanosecond less that he was spending looking at it, because the novelty had worn off, because it does, that triggered the algorithm to no longer serve him. If if you are producing like good content, and now, there's amazing AI generated content that glorifies the Soviet Union now. Like it's so, the intensification of the internet is like such a huge part of this entire issue. It's pretty easy to manipulate people's legitimate worries, grievances, fears, and insecurities into the comfort of missing and feeling a certain way that then allows someone in power control you better. So for us on individual level, I think we need to be connecting all these dots and making choices based on these connections. On the level of systems and scale, I think we're all need to be doing what we can, I guess.
So there's two really important points there. One is that we have to look for social change, structural change, because you have social stratification, economic exposure, electoral disempowerment in these spaces. And those are the drivers for belief in falsehoods and a yearning for what were misconceived
But also, I
notions.
think it's important not to dismiss, right? Because there is an electoral disempowerment, and it's huge and it's massive. And I feel like I'm personally on the receiving end of it. But there is also, for some people, the electoral empowerment. There are lots of people who are happy to see the changes that have happened. And we need to still find a way for understanding what is it that makes them happy. It's too easy to dismiss Trump voters as just, you know,
Racist,
misogynistic.
misogynist, populist. I mean, and the other thing to observe in all of this too is that, you know, while Jill, I wholeheartedly agree, and, you know, conduct research to try and put data around experiences and feelings, to bolster understanding. But we're in a situation now where not only are we dealing with the shitification of the internet and viralized disinformation alongside weaponized nostalgia, we're seeing the erasure of history. I mean, in the US, we're seeing naval ships renamed to avoid any kind of association with activists past and civil rights heroes. The Smithsonian is taking down web pages. Research organizations are unpublishing scientific research if it references female, women, disinformation. I mean, I don't know if you want to say anything about that or we go to the audience, but...
Well, I think this moment is also an existential threat to independent media in the United States. Who owns the Washington Post? The Los Angeles Times, the Wall Street Journal. And I don't think mainstream journalists, my colleagues, really understand the moment in which we're living. And so we're still using 20th century tactics in the 21st century. The idea
and vocabulary.
Yes, exactly, exactly. The idea that this is normal and trying to normalize it is foolhardy. We have to call things out for what they are. I remember the New York Times contorting itself to say that Donald Trump was lying.
Yeah.
Because that is a nasty word in the world of the New York Times. To call somebody a liar means a lot. And they just couldn't come to the point of saying that. But you have to call a spade a spade.
Yeah.
And we have to also, this point, we in the mainstream media think of Donald Trump as a serious person, okay? Donald Trump, to me, I know the type. He's a street thug, mentality-wise. But he's a rich white guy, very bravado. And so they're playing into that. Call him out for who he is, and we'll deal with him. But we have to be honest. We have to be factual. Forget about the nostalgia, what he's saying, watch what he's doing. Yeah. And we're not doing that enough.
Yeah, and we can refer to history, actually, to find justification for use of words like authoritarianism, right? And that is not happening either. I want to come to the audience now. I think we have 10 minutes left because we started 10 minutes late. Stop me if I'm wrong. But if we can take any questions from the audience. I see a hand over here. Is that a hand there? No, that's somebody trying to fix their hair who almost got asked a question. Yes, and there's one here to start with. And if you want to tell us your name, feel free.
Lela Sisauri. Thank you very much. It was really a pleasure listening to you exploring various aspects of how nostalgia has been, weaponized and used in different contexts, whether it's America or Georgia. And that's absolutely, very relevant today. But I kind of missed, to be honest, exploration of what were the enablers, what enabled people to crave for nostalgia, and what they see in nostalgia that might be lacking in today's reality. And obviously in America and in South Africa and in Georgia, there are slightly different contexts politically and socially. But I just wanted to say whether dealing with nostalgia and attacking it or saying how wrong it was is almost like running after the horse after it's bolted from the stables. Whether we should be spending time more effectively at addressing whether it was moral certainty, whether it's idea of social justice, or whether it's idea of a political access to power and disempowerment of people, whatever it is that we have problems with, that leads people to go back, re-embroider memories and sit it there.
Yeah, and I think we did start to address that, but I will ask you to respond.
I mean, my personally answer is yes, and that's what I mean by addressing the structural changes, because of course, the reason the ground for this is fertile is because of real grievances, because of real problems, because of inequality, because of poverty, because of fear, because of like endless, right? And what authoritarian regimes or those in power now are very good at is identifying and localizing and targeting them very narrowly, whether it is telling I don't know, a Georgian man to be proud of Stalin, or a man in Florida to claim his masculinity back. Like it's the vulnerabilities that are identified, and then these campaigns, and they are very often very kind of organized and centralist campaigns, are then built on. The messaging tends to be very precise. They're very good at this.
Garry.
Well, in the US, for instance, there's a whole history with this, right? After slavery, you had Reconstruction, then you had Jim Crow. After the 1960s civil rights movement, you have a backlash, and this is yet another backlash to progresses that made women university presidents. My God, shocking. Black people, Asians, and other people of color doing okay. I mean, and so this is a threat to certain class of people. And so what to do about it? I think the problem is that democracy is difficult because it's for the people, by the people. And if the people don't nurture it, this is where we are.
Jill.
Yeah, I think both things need focus. We need to look at what are the driving factors that make the ground fertile for nostalgia, but we also have to call it out and point it out as we go along at the same time. So it's not one or the other in my opinion.
Yeah, I would agree with that too. You have to describe and explain what's going on to an extent in parallel with addressing the undercurrents and causes. There was another question, I think, over here.
Hi. My name's Hugh MacLeod. I'm communications lead at IRCT. It's an anti-torture network. We'll be actually on Sunday. But my question is then, I mean, nostalgia is because people are feeling lost and that life isn't good, right? And that's really based on the state that they're in, that the state isn't delivering things. So my question is, can't nostalgia become a weapon for human rights? We've had a long discussion now about how it's a bad thing, but just from a UK perspective, we love nostalgia, right? And in our long and checkered history, we've occasionally done the right thing. In 1939, we did the right thing. We made sacrifices, and we have a huge nostalgia about that. And I think that's a good thing. There was a time when American lawyers created international criminal law by prosecuting Nazi war criminals. There was a time when Lebanese lawyers wrote the Genocide Convention, Polish lawyers.
So what you're saying is make nostalgia great again.
Yeah. Because you can't get around the human need for nostalgia, I don't think. You can expose it when it's used wrongly, but can't we, as communications leads, human rights activists, can't we use it as well? That would be my question.
There's a question there also from Nabila, I think I'm looking at. No.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. So happy to be back and to see Zag again. I have a question in sense of maybe following up my previous speaker about the communications and importance of communications. Realizing where we are, and Julie, you mentioned after this will pass, what we have learned. Will it pass?
Yeah.
Because let's be honest, when we feel we were the strongest, we have failed. do we actually realize why we failed? Do we actually know, are we getting together? Are we getting stronger? Are we trying to figure out what we have done wrong to not be here where we are? Because honestly, it was also mentioned like, oh, we stay in the same circles. To be honest, I feel as times are getting worse, the circles are getting smaller. I think we're having less communications. I think even among common ground or common people who we think are in the same boat, even we do not talk anymore. It's like everybody's like laid down and waiting for something to happen. And that worries me. It's like, yeah, maybe sometimes waiting is strategic, but maybe sometimes that waiting can become a slow death. And then we might pass the moment of coming back somehow. Because again, we give more and more power. We see us becoming less and less powerful. We see more and more media living the spaces. We see more and more being dependent on social media. And we know how controlled it can be.
Yep. So let me...
What is next?
Yes.
Can you tell, what is the solution, if you can say, from point where we are today?
Exactly.
Thank you.
Let me just respond very briefly to your point about making nostalgia great again. There are really interesting studies, actually, by researchers from the field of psychology and psychiatry about the value of nostalgia, particularly as a tool for encouraging people with dementia and Alzheimer's to stay engaged and communicative through reference to memory. Music is particularly powerful. So there is definitely value in that. And historians who study this, have made similar observations. And if I can then move to the other question and ask you to respond with final comments. Panelists, I mean, essentially you're asking, how do we avoid getting stuck in the yesterday? How do we get to the day after tomorrow, which is Zeg, right? And here we are. So Natalia, let's start with you.
So trying to be brief, Hugh, so I think about this a lot, and I do think, I think the answer is yes, but I think it's a yes with the caveat that this is a battle of narratives, and there is a narrative that is being very intentionally pushed on one side, and, what is the kind of the other side, right? Like if we take an example of Georgia, you can be nostalgic for Georgia that gave the world one of its ugliest dictators, or you can be nostalgic for Georgia that elected the first Muslim woman MP to parliament at the time where most women in Europe could not vote. Like we can be making that choice. Georgia's occupied, so making that choice in Georgia has become increasingly difficult. And I think the other side, so to say, right, who kind of the anti-authoritarian side, the people who are willing to do the dirty work of democracy and embrace the fact that it's difficult, I think they've come too late to realizing how sort of like what a war is going on. One of my favorite, I told the story in Perugia, one of my favorite stories is the fact that, when the country's previous president, Mikhail Saakashvili, went to Moscow, that was his first official visit to a foreign country, was Moscow, because he was trying to sort of figure out relations with Russia. One thing that Putin was obsessed with is telling him, do not open the Soviet occupation museum in Tbilisi. Russia did not want Georgia to open the Soviet occupation museum. These things, matter. So I think to your question, I think we're on a I think they're on an upswing, as you said, Garry. There was a period when dictators were falling. There's now the period when they're back, and I think a lot about. So what do we do? And I think, to me, part of the answer, I think, in conservation, there is a concept of protected spaces, right? In the Soviet Union, there were kitchens. In a way, Georgia itself was a protected space because of we've managed to hold on to the language and the culture because of the mountain. So how do we hold on to the values that at least will still be there when the pendulum swings? I think that's the least we can do.
Great. And Garry, if you want to...
Well, I think I do have hope. I mean, obviously, we're living people. We have to be hopeful. The hope that I have is this, that Donald Trump's overreach will really galvanize the American people. Because I know that the American people, fundamentally, we're good people. despite whatever the government is doing. And it's going to take Americans a while to really understand what's happening. But when they do, I think you're going to see that's when the backlash is going to come, because you're going to hear this. That's not who we are, and this is no good.
Yeah, and you were lamenting in Perugia about how long it was taken for Americans to wake up. We haven't got time to go there, but just to observe that. And Jillian.
No, thanks. I think in terms of nostalgia and using that as a positive force, I think the word weaponization is key. When it's been used for harm is when it's going to be bad. And to use it as, in South Africa, there are so many wonderful, beautiful, historical things that really define us as a nation, the TRC, and how we created that platform for sharing of story is something that we should be proud of and reminding people of. That will bring some cohesiveness back into the society. So yes, we should be looking at how we use nostalgia in a positive way, which brings me to what we can do, and that is for us to be a bit more organized. You know, the campaigns around weaponization are very organized. They're interconnected. They feed off each other. Whereas what we are doing is we're all off in our separate little ways, trying to do our best, but without the amplification of each other, without the ripple effect taking place. So I think if we can find ways to connect, to share stories, to amplify the work across our own geographic boundaries, I think we'll have more effect.
Yeah. So the hope is to focus on a networked approach, a creative networked approach to a networked assault that is malicious. We can organize. Thank you, everybody. Good luck.